Today we've got Neil Creek presenting a discussion on colour in astrophotography. Is it really that colour? And for those of you who don't know Neil, Neil's a professional photographer. He's also the resident astrophotography coordinator at Mount Burnett Observatory. He does a lot of outreach, teaching and introducing the public to astrophotography. He also is my co-presenter on most of our boot camps that we run here at the ASV, where we introduce newcomers to astrophotography, how to use their equipment and how to get started in the subject and the hobby. And the next boot camp I hope to run in late September, November, as long as we don't clash with Vic South. So without further ado from me, I'd like you to welcome Neil and his presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Paul. I've been a photographer for a long time, and I studied psychology at university. I was a major in psychology, so the concept of colour in photography has always interested me, but in astrophotography in particular, it's a challenge. Doing a lot of outreach as I do, the first question, or the most common question that I get asked by people looking at my photos is it really that colour? Because the general public is, you know, used to look at the night sky and not seeing any colour. They, at night time, they don't see any colour. They look at my photos and they find it hard to believe, in fact this is the case with just about any astro photos, they find it hard to believe that the colours are real, that that's what it actually looks like. So they have to ask, is it really that colour? And it's a difficult question to answer. You can't simply say yes, because there's multiple layers of complexity in colour, and that's what I'm going to try and address in this talk. I thought the question was asked often enough and it's complex enough that it needed to be addressed. Now, I am an astrophotographer of about 5 or 6 years experience. I've only been doing telescopic astrophotography for 2 years, and I haven't done any narrowband or mono imaging yet. So there's going to be a few of you in this room that will know a lot more about certain parts of this talk than I do, and I may make a couple of mistakes. So if you see anything, just call out and say, Neil, actually, and let me know, because I'm always learning about this too. And also, I'm more than happy to answer any questions throughout the talk. So just put up your hand or just call out my name, Neil, and I'll answer as best as I can as we go along. All right, so there is a real issue with perceiving colour in that, well, colour is a perception. There is no such thing in the universe as colour. It's our interpretation of physical constants, that is the wavelength of light. And the most difficult issue with us as astrophotographers is that our eyes can't see very faint things. In fact, we can't see the colour, especially in very faint things. And so you're not going to be seeing colour with your eyes. So I could answer the first question, is that colour real, straight off the bat and say, no, it's not. You will never see that colour without assistance, so it's not real. But we want to take it past that. We want to see parts of the universe that our eyes can't see, which is why we use our telescopes and our cameras to capture that. So, just checking out my notes, making sure I'm covering everything. If there's no way we could see anything, and even see any colour with our naked eyes, and even if we're looking through a large telescope, the vast majority of nebulae are not going to show any colour to our eyes. There's a few ones that are particularly bright, like the Orion Nebula, the Tarantula Nebula. Some people can see some colour in that, but the vast majority are going to be black and white. So even with significant enhancement to our eyes, we're still not going to see that colour. And so we have to do it with our camera. The reason I keep looking up here is because my computer screen is not mirroring, it's extending, and so I can't check my notes as I go. I just have to look up on the screen there. So we allow post-processing to reveal any colour and make things bright, then a modified digital SLR, one-shot camera and LRGB images, which are carefully calibrated, as real as photographers can make them. So basically, if we want to capture colour as our eyes would see it, then that's the method we need to do. using a modified digital SLR or a one-shot astro camera, or using LRGB filters, because of the way our eyes work. We see in RGB. Narrowband images, however, are different, and when you process them in natural colours, it doesn't look right. The main reason being for that is that sulfur and hydrogen alpha, they glow in red colours that are so close on the spectrum that our eyes would have difficulty separating them, and computer displays at the moment cannot display that difference. It's completely outside the range of the technology to display it. And so there is no way to capture a natural narrowband image unless you're doing bicolour and you're assigning those colour channels to their specific wavelengths. But generally, when you're doing narrowband, you want to make it look pretty, you want to show the detail in the different elements, the different channels, and so you assign them colour. So those colours aren't real, but they do represent characteristics of the object that you're looking at. So we kind of need to come into the question of what is real. How do we define real? Is real a reflection of our personal experience of something, or is it a reflection of how the object is? If that's the case, then false colour narrowband images are real because they're showing a quality of the object that we're capturing. That is, where the different elements are and how brightly they glow. And you know what? I thought that was getting ahead of myself. That was my last slide. I hit home instead of page. Yeah, hit end instead of page down. Okay, so thank you very much. That is the summary of what we're going to talk about today. So let's get back to the start then, okay? And we will go through why all those things are as complex as they are. And the first question, and this is what I studied in psychology, is colour is a really strange concept. It is something that exists only in our minds. It is not intrinsic to the universe, and there is even variation in perception of colour biologically between individuals. I'm sure there's a few of you in this room that have got colour blindness. You see colour in a way differently from what those who don't have colour blindness see. There's even been some discussion as to whether there's super colour sensitivity, where people have an additional receptor cell in their eyes that can see a wavelength that other people can't see, or whether they have cells that are more functional and can see a broader frequency than others. So you can't say that colour is universal because it's the most subjective thing you can imagine. It's different for every person. So it is the brain trying to interpret a quality of the universe, and that being the wavelength of light. And that was very useful in evolutionary terms. It allowed us to tell the difference between ripe berries and spoiled berries, or between healthy meat and dangerous meat. It was a survival strategy. And so the way it's evolved has got nothing to do with how it is best to see the universe. It's how it's best to help us as animals survive. And colour perception is varying, of course, between different animals in the world. We've got bees can see in ultraviolet. We've got other animals that can see into further reaches, or they have different types of cells that sense different frequencies of light, and when they're put together, they see different colours. Although even saying that, seeing different colours, you can't really say that, because what is a colour to someone who has a different sensory perception system? You can't say, this is red. Well, what's their red? They may not even have the ability to detect wavelengths of light that we call red. And being psychological, it is very easy to manipulate and to distort and deceive. You've probably all seen lots of optical illusions where you have a coloured square and then you look at another coloured square and they look completely different, but then you take away the surrounding environment and they look the same. The proximity of nearby colours affects how we see that colour, but the colour is still the same. The brain is still seeing the same thing. The same wavelengths of light are activating the same cells in our retina that trigger the same electrical impulses to the brain, and it's not until it gets back here that our brain does funny business with it. And that's because at some point in our evolution that was helpful to us, but the side effects created this illusion that means that we can't be confident in the colours that we see. And it changes depending on many different things: the ambient light, the mood that you're in, as I said, the proximity of other colours, and it's a chain. So I mentioned briefly there, we start with the retina, we go through to the optical nerve, we go back to the brain, then there's a whole bunch of different brain areas that separate out what we're seeing and process them separately, then bring it all together into some sort of reality constructing part of the brain, and any step along that chain can be disrupted. So you can have some cells missing in your eye, and if you can't have the say the blue receptors in your eye, then you're going to have no blue in your vision. You can have damage to the retina itself where the cells are burnt by looking at the sun or something like that. You can have problems with transferring the electrical signals along the optic nerve. You can have brain damage. You can have pressure on the brain from a headache or any other sort of issues like that that temporarily or permanently influence how we perceive what we see and what colours we have. So it's really, really difficult to pin down and say this is what a colour is and this is what it is across the whole universe. Everyone has the same perception, because that's not true. So it's going to be really hard to explain to anyone and ask, is this colour real, to say it simply because of just perception alone, but there's more to it than that. So I've briefly gone over this, but I'll just read through the list of the path through the from object to perception. So it starts off with the electromagnetic radiation, particular frequency. That's what we define scientifically as its colour. It goes through the cornea and the lens, and then through the fluid in the eye, and then onto the retina. So there's multiple optical surfaces, and as we photographers know, each optical interface creates a change in the light that passes through it. It then stimulates photosensitive cells on the retina, rod and cone cells. That then stimulates the firing of neurons that carries that signal up through the optical nerve to the optical processing part of the brain, which is at the back of our head. That then processes the signal to extract components of it, whether it's edges, shapes, motion or colour, and sends that information off to different parts of the brain that process those separately. You can actually have people who have, for example, face blindness. There's a part of our brain which processes and recognises faces. And those unfortunate people, they will know they're looking at a face. They'll probably even be able to tell it's a male or a female face. But for the life of them, they won't be able to tell you whose face it is, even if it's their own parents. The brain just simply cannot do that processing. Every other part of their perception works just fine. It's just that one little part of it that doesn't work. And that can happen to any part of our processing system, whether it's edge detection or colour detection. From the processing of all those different centres, that is then brought together into a part of the brain which then processes it as a whole, brings it together, decides what is important, and emphasises that into our awareness, our conscious experience of the world. Again, there's lots of optical illusions that take advantage of that. There's a classic one where there's a bunch of students, it's almost always students in these examples, playing basketball, and the question you are asked when you're watching the video is, how many times is the basketball passed between people? And you watch it, you count, 11, 12, 13, 14 times they pass it. And then the researcher asks you, okay, how many gorillas were there? And you're like, what? And then they say, go back, watch for the gorilla. And as people are passing the ball backwards and forwards between each other, another student in a gorilla suit walks right through the middle of the scene. And most people don't see it until you point it out to them. So something as dramatic and obvious as a gorilla walking through a scene can be completely ignored by the brain because it's prioritised different things. And that's why actually eyewitness evidence in a court is the least reliable sort of evidence. If you're going to be convicted based on eyewitness testimony alone, challenge that. Say, I want forensic evidence. Okay, and that then leads to the subjective experience of colour. And of course that means that colour is subjective to everyone. Everyone experiences it slightly differently. If I say it's a pinkish red, someone else might say it's a reddish pink. And you can't tell them otherwise because they are correct. That's what they have labelled those colours to be. So beyond that first step of the electromagnetic frequency of the light, everything else is subjective. Okay? We can use equipment to measure the frequency of the light, and from scientific principles say, because of definitions, wavelengths of light from this range to this range are yellow. We can be confident in that being correct. But anything past that is subjective and open to being manipulated. Any questions so far? No? Fantastic. Remind me at the end of this to show you that basketball bouncing video. It's not going to work on any of you now because I've told you about the trick, but it is quite surprising. Take it home to your family and friends and show them and see how many you can get. All right, so let's look at the eye. When we are perceiving light, we have different cells in our eyes that detect that light. I always get them mixed up. I believe it's the cones that detect the colour and rods that detect the intensity. We have far more rods than we have cones, and we have far more rods in the centre of our eye, the fovea, the point at which the middle of our perception, where our eye is looking, is projected. Because when we're in dark environments, we need to be able to, sorry, it's the other way around. We have more cones in the very centre because in most of our life we're in the daylight environment. We have lots and lots of light around, and perceiving colour accurately is far more important to our survival than perceiving detail in low light. So we don't have many of those cone cells right on the fovea, so at night we can't see colour. The way to then see that detail is we use averted vision. That's because we're putting the part of the image that we want to see that's faint away from the area which has fewer of the light sensing cells and more of the colour sensing cells into a part where we do have more of those rod cells. So I'm sure all of you here are familiar with the concept of averted vision. We have three different types of cells. They're small, medium and large, and though the size of them relates to the wavelength of the light that they're detecting. Okay? So the smaller cells are sensitive to the blue lights. The medium length ones are sensitive to the green colours, and the long ones are sensitive to the red. So it's a nice physical correlation there. But you'll notice that we don't have yellow sensing cells. We don't have purple sensing cells. That means we don't actually detect those frequencies individually. And in fact, if you look around the 480 nanometer range between the blue and the green, we're very poorly sensitive to that colour, the sort of the aqua colour. We can only detect it by having the blue and the green cells detect a little bit of each and then merging it together in the brain as perception. None of this happens in the eye, just the sensing, that the detection happens in the eye, but the actual sensing, making the colour, seeing yellow, happens in the brain, not in the eye. So we're only looking at a very tiny slice of the whole spectrum of light from...
What is the vertical axis?
The vertical axis is just relative intensity or relative sensitivity. So the blue or the short sensing cells are most sensitive at around 440 nanometers.
Yeah. So we do see the colors.
Yeah, we see all the way in that range.
Intermediate colors,
yep,
but in a much lower sensitivity.
That's correct, yes.
Those are correlated.
And we don't sense them as themselves, we sense them as the mix of the two different cells or the three different cells that overlap at that frequency. So there's no purple sensing cell. There's just blue and red, and where they overlap is where the purple frequencies are. So, yes? No, go ahead.
I was going to say, has there been a study done that shows that all of those developed at the same time in our evolution, or did they some develop at different times?
I don't know, but my suspicion would be that they may have developed at different times because different animals have different quantities and varieties of sensing cells. Dogs, for example, I believe only have the blue and the green. So they see everything in tones of yellows and blues and greens and stuff. They don't have any red sensitivity. That suggests to me that evolution said that it wasn't necessary to have that for dogs to survive and be successful, but it was for humans. And if they were required to all develop at the same time, it would make sense that across the animal kingdom, there would be more animals that have all of those same types of cells. So that's just speculation. I don't know for certain, but I think that would be a likely explanation.
So we may not have the same view now as we did prehistorically.
Depends how far into prehistory you go. I would say all of Homo sapiens would have had the same colour experience that we do. But if you went back 10, 15, 50 million years, then it would certainly be different. Although mammals may also have the same experience, just depending on which mammal and how far back you go. I'm not a biologist, so I can't really say for certain.
Neil, can I
It
raise
depends what
something?
knowledge dinosaurs were.
Yes.
The issue of red light, which we as astronomers are always supposed to use when we're in each other's company.
Yes.
And also, if you ever watch war movies and submarines go to red alert and suddenly everything's red.
Yep.
Why red? Why do we go to red?
I don't know the biological answer to that, but
Maybe the dinosaurs were red?
it seems to be that it's about the sensitivity and the response of the eye's adjustment to brightness levels. So we're sitting in here in a relatively dimly lit room, but we can see everything quite clearly. If we were to step outside the door and, you know, look quickly around, for a few moments we would be unable to perceive detail because our eyes would be overwhelmed. Okay? The way that works is that the brain receives the influx of greater amounts of light and it starts a cascade of biological responses, closing the iris, bleaching the cells, all these sorts of things which extend the dynamic range of the eye and allow us to see in the detail out there, which of course sacrifices our ability to see detail in here. It's, again, this is speculation, but it stands to reason that the red frequencies of light trigger that response less. So they don't force the eye to shut down the iris, they don't bleach the cells in order to cause them to be less sensitive. I would imagine that there'd be some studies done on that, particularly as you say, this is something that's valuable in wartime, and war always attracts money to spend on studies. So if you wanted to pursue that question, I'm sure that you'd be able to find an answer. But that would be my guess. Thank you. All right, so on the right here we are seeing that spectral response curve, which is talking about how sensitive a receptor is to different frequencies of light. And so the colours that are out there, what makes them? It's the combination of those together. So, the stars, what makes their colour? Now, I'm hoping most of you know this because we're all astronomers. Basically, it is the hotter a star, the more blue it is in its frequency. This is to do with black body radiation and Kelvin temperatures. The hotter the Kelvin temperature of the actual star, the shorter the wavelength of light that it's putting out because of the higher energy that goes into those photons. And so that colour can tell us a great deal about the star. It can tell us its age, its size, its composition if we break it down into its spectra. And because they're relatively bright, we actually are able to sense the colours of some stars natively without assistance. It's one of the best demonstrations as an outreach person talking about colour of stars is to tell people to look at Orion and the contrast between Betelgeuse and Rigel. They are very stark when you point it out. Betelgeuse is far more reddish, Rigel is far more bluish. And the only reason we can detect those colours is because they are so bright, those stars, that they actually trigger our cone cells in our fovea. But they are the only colour that you can typically see with the naked eye at night, and of course meteors and a few other things that are particularly bright being the exception. As Phil Hart would tell you, particularly regarding his winning Malin Awards video, most aurora photos that you see are drastically exaggerated in their colour. You will be lucky to see colour in most aurorae. Phil was lucky. He went to a lot of effort to go to the best places in the world at the best time to see the aurorae, and he said that subjectively he could see colour in them. And the animation he presented to the Malin Awards, he processed to match what he said was his experience of the colour in the aurora. So there aren't many objects out there that we can directly perceive to have colour in the night sky. What about galaxies? Well, again, we can say straight off the bat, we're never going to see any colour in any galaxy. Not even our own. We're in the middle of it, and we still can't see any colour in it. So the average colour of a galaxy, or a typical galaxy, is white. Because the whole spectrum of colours from stars, from the bluest to the most yellow, they average out as a white colour, given their populations, their brightness and so forth. In fact, many astrophotographers use galaxies as a white reference when they're trying to calibrate their photos, which we'll come back to in a bit. So, yeah, you're not going to see any colour with a telescope from a galaxy. You're only going to do it when you capture it with a camera. Reflection nebulae. These are some of my favourites. These things are huge clouds of gas and dust, mostly hydrogen, and they are throughout the whole universe, concentrated in galaxies, but there's not a huge... there's a correlation between their locations near stars, but there's still a huge amount of this gas and dust nowhere near stars. And when it is near a star, you will often have the colour, the light of that star reflecting off that dust. Imagine it being like headlights on high beams in a fog. If the headlights were yellow, you would see the fog looking yellow. If the headlights were blue, you'd see the fog looking blue. That's the same thing with reflection nebulae. So it reflects the colour of a nearby star that's bright enough, and that means that the colour of the star influences the colour of the nebulae. So we can get reflection nebulae that have colours along the entire Kelvin spectrum, which is the yellows through the blues. Notice though that there's no green on that spectrum. Now this is just a little aside here into colour theory, but we are used to the primary colours, whether it's RGB for light or red, blue and yellow for pigments. Well, in nature those colours, or at least the emission and reflection of light in space, there's only one spectrum along there that it works on, and that is the colour temperature spectrum from the yellows through the blues. There is a opposing spectrum that cuts across it, which is the magentas through the greens. And there's lots of that on Earth. We see that reflected on plants or various places. Can't think off the top of my head right now, but if you're talking about stars and therefore nebulae, you're almost always going to have them across the colour temperature spectrum. Emission nebulae, though, are slightly different because they're not reflecting the light around them. They're actually glowing themselves. They're creating the light as a result of the energy that's being fed into the gas from nearby energetic stars. So we don't really need to go into quantum physics to talk about this, but if you wanted to research it deeper, the story starts in quantum physics. So when a energetic photon hits an atom, there are electrons orbiting the nucleus of the atom. That photon is absorbed into the electron. The electron gains the energy. So the photon's gone, the electron is changed, and that causes the electron to jump up an energy level. And electrons can only do that in discrete steps. That's the quantum theory there. When the energy is being absorbed by the electron, it can't hold on to it for long. It doesn't like excess energy, it's unstable. And so it wants to go back down into the orbital level that it used to be, and the only way to do that is to get rid of that excess energy. But because it can only drop down in a fixed distance, it has to emit that energy at a fixed wavelength. So that's why we get emissions. And those emissions are a number of different colours, but most commonly this pink colour from hydrogen alpha. And I'm sure you've all heard that. The hydrogen alpha is basically the hydrogen atom having an electron jump up its shell, and then when it re-emits that photon, it drops back down the shell, and it emits it in that specific wavelength of hydrogen alpha, that pink colour. So that's not on the blue through yellow spectrum of the Kelvin. It's itself, it's a single point. There are different elements that, yes?
There's more than one colour.
Yes, there's hydrogen beta as well, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. That range is infinite. It's called the Lyman series. So the combination of the first two, which is deep in red, or almost infrared, which is H alpha, it's not pink at all, it's very, very deep red.
Yeah.
And the next one, which is close to oxygen 3, so H beta is in blue almost.
Yep.
So those two make it pink.
Okay.
There'll be even more
Yep.
going into the UV part of the spectrum, but their energy levels are much lower.
Yep.
Because
The difference in the
mostly
shells
emit-
is smaller.
they're mostly emit. And the only reason why we can see these nebulae is because of the H beta.
Right.
The H alpha, we almost
It'd be outside our
not-
visual range.
Yeah, we're not sensitive to it at all.
Yep.
So that's why when we look at these nebulae, the H beta filter helps,
Okay.
and H alpha does not.
Right.
And the visual, you can have these H alpha filters that we use for CCD for imaging.
Yep.
Try to look at any of these nebulae, you're not going to see anything.
Yep.
Maybe some of the really, really bright ones you can see, hints of red, but you're not going to see anything. The visual H alpha filters, they're normally combined both oxygen 3 and or H alpha, H beta, and oxygen 3, so you can see some color.
So are the visual filters a dual band pass? They look through two narrow frequencies?
Yes.
Right.
And most of these they'll look green. That's why.
Yeah.
And that's because of H beta.
Photographically, when we're using a hydrogen alpha filter, we're excluding the hydrogen beta, aren't we?
We are.
So a photo like this with a one-shot color camera is different from a photo
right,
with
that's
a
right.
narrowband filter, because we're getting the hydrogen alpha and hydrogen beta there.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you for the clarification. That was great. I didn't know that. Okay, so as we've just had pointed out, not only does each each atom emit multiple frequencies based on the energy that it receives, but different elements also emit. So we've got oxygen, which is a very common one that we use in our photography, and I kept calling it silicon sulfur. That's right. Thank you. And they also emit on multiple wavelengths as well. So this is a further complication. We can't just say that's the color of hydrogen, that's the color of oxygen. Color is very complex. So we've covered that. All right. There are also invisible colors. We've just talked a bit about that, such as ultraviolet and infrared. It's scientific equipment can detect, but our eyes can't. Our cameras can detect a little bit of that, but they're not really tuned to. Actually, there are a lot of hobbyists that go out and take ultraviolet photos, and they use a UV pass filter, which blocks every other light except for UV. And if you hold it up to the world, it looks black, because our eyes can't detect UV, but the camera sensor can. So when you put it on the camera sensor, use a long exposure because there's very little light getting through, you will see what the world looks like in ultraviolet, and it's fascinating. And incidentally, since we're talking about ultraviolet light and emission, when we are using glow-in-the-dark colours, so for example, highlighter pens or black light paints, they are illuminated by, when you illuminate those by ultraviolet, that ultraviolet energy is absorbed by the materials in the pigments, and they then emit that light back out at a different frequency, and it appears to come from the pigment, so it looks like it's glowing. Which it is, but it's not glowing in the wavelength of light that was first energizing it. Okay, so where are we up to? So we've got different kinds of objects that emit lights, as well as planetary nebulae, comets, and of course the planets. The colour green is almost non-existent in space. We rarely see that. In fact, the only places I've seen it has been within the solar system, so meteors, aurorae, comets. You just don't seem to get it in nature outside the solar system. And that is actually allowing us as astrophotographers a neat little trick to use a bit of noise reduction filtering. If you use a Pix Insight, there's a filter in it called SCNR, and you can tell it to remove all pixels that are pure green, because there's no pure green in space. You are removing only then the colour noise. So if you've got a pure green pixel and you're not photographing a comet or an aurora, then you are not actually wanting that pixel, because there's nothing out there that makes that colour. So throwing it out, that means you're guaranteed you're throwing out the colour noise into the green channel. And that's what I just talked about. Great. Alright, so this is an example of the emission spectra of the Orion Nebula, M42. So it's clear there we've got a number of spikes. We've got from left to right, we've got the hydrogen beta, we've got two oxygen 3 ones there, which are very close to each other, and the hydrogen alpha. So keep that in mind, but when you look at that, that does not look like the colour of something that is reflecting light. Okay, it's definitely emitting light in very narrow frequency ranges because of that emission from the atoms. If we overlay the human visual perception on that, we see one of nature's great jokes on us amateur astronomers. All of those peaks are in the less sensitive parts of our eye's perception. So the hydrogen beta and the oxygen are in the dip around the aqua colour, and hydrogen alpha is pretty much out of the range of our sensitivity. So if we had shifted those frequency sensitivity curves to slightly different places, we'd probably be able to see these things much brighter in the night sky. We may even be able to see colour with them just looking at the night sky. But in one of the cruel ironies, we don't get to.
Excuse me, I just wonder whether that's shapes there explain why it actually looks slightly greenish
Yes,
for a telescope?
it is.
Yeah.
Because our eyes, despite what that curve will tell you, are more sensitive to green. If you actually look at it, where the lines overlap, essentially this is the brightest thing in the Orion Nebula to our eyes. Okay, not this, but this. And therefore, if that's the brightest colour in the Orion Nebula, if you're going to see any colour, it'll be green. And it's the same with the Tarantula Nebula too, I believe. So that does explain why these predominantly hydrogen alpha and hydrogen beta emitting nebulae look green to us and not pink, because, or not red, because we really can't see that at all. Our sensitivity there is like, you know, a fraction of the sensitivity. This here is a scale of relative sensitivity, or relative emission in that case.
Quick question.
Yes.
So my matrix is RGGB.
Yep.
So I've got two greens in one shot column.
That's right.
What's that giving us as an advantage, or is it just trying to bring light into our wavelengths?
Because the Bayer filter was invented for daytime digital photography, it's meant to be more representative of the way that our eyes work for daytime. And our eyes are more sensitive or have greater response to green. That's why emergency exit signs are green. They're more visible through smoke and in the dark. And it's really not designed for astrophotography at all. If you wanted to design a one-shot colour for astrophotography, you wouldn't have any green sensors on there at all. In fact, you'd probably have a series of narrowband filters over each of those sensors. Okay, so how do we capture this? The digital revolution has drastically changed how we capture colour. It's improved the quality of the photos we can take and the ease of which we take them. So that's why I'm going to be focusing on today when we're talking about capturing colour on digital. I'm sorry if there's any film astrophotographers out there, but I think you're a rare breed now. So the camera sensors are actually an array of millions of tiny little solar panels. They take the light energy. That energy causes an electron to be released, and that electron is then theoretically detected and captured by the camera sensor. It's a whole lot more complicated than that, of course, as these things always are, but that's the fundamental basics of it, taking light and converting it into energy, or electricity, I should say. And modern designs are actually quite efficient at doing that. The rate at which it converts, or the accuracy with which it converts photons to electrons, is called the quantum efficiency. And most SLRs these days are around about 40 to 60% efficient. Some of the really expensive and high quality cameras, I think CCDs are a good example of this, can get 70–80% quantum efficiency, which is a huge improvement, and why CCDs are still used even though CMOSs are far more widespread and cheaper these days. To capture colour, we need to separate out the wavelengths that are being detected. If they're all being detected at the same time and we don't know which wavelengths are being detected more than others, then we're getting a monochrome image. And that's exactly what happens with a monochrome sensor. If you're using a monochrome camera with no filters on it, every photo site, that is the little solar cell, will not discriminate over what wavelengths are generating the electric current. Any photon that hits it, that it's sensitive to, will get converted into an electron, and all electrons are the same. It doesn't know the difference between one electron or another. And so you need to differentiate the different wavelengths of light, and the way we do that is with filters. So with a one-shot colour camera, as Stu just pointed out, we have the red, the green, the blue filters over each of the photo sites in groups of 4. And that's red, green and blue is designed to match the red, green and blue sensitivity of our eyes, because we want to, typically when using cameras, capture colours that appear similar to what they do to our eyes. That's the way cameras are designed. Again, if you're doing it for astrophotography, it's different, but many of the cameras that we use are designed for other uses, and we astrophotographers just pick up the crumbs and do what we can with them. So for the natural colours, we want the RGB, and there's 2 primary ways to do that, with either one-shot colour cameras or with mono cameras and using RGB filters. So having a look at the one-shot colour cameras, you can see there we've got a graphical representation on the right of the photo sites. And the reason I say photo sites rather than pixels is because a pixel is an output. Okay, if you're looking at your computer screen, you see a pixel. If you're looking at a file, they're all in pixels. But the camera has, it's a bit misleadingly called megapixels, but there's more photosites on a camera sensor than there are in megapixels. The megapixels is the output resolution of the file. But for each pixel, theoretically, we've got 4 photosites. But even that's not as simple as that, because if we just took those 4 photosites, calculated what average color that would be, and did that across the whole sensor, then we get interference pattern effects where there's too much of a difference between neighboring pixels, and you have things like moire. For example, when you have an interview on television where there's interview subjects wearing a very, very tight striped shirt, you see these interference patterns. Or if you're taking a photograph through a fly wire, you can often see rainbow halos effect. That's the result of moire. And so cameras have either or both a filter over the top, which sort of blurs the light slightly, and they do a bit of post-processing when turning the photosites into pixels to blur the average around the edge of those pixels. So one-shot color in that way is actually slightly lower resolution, because they have to blur these things together. When you're using these cameras, you also have, or when they're being constructed, they have these filters on top of the whole sensor to cut out light that is beyond what we can see. So it cuts out infrared, it cuts out ultraviolet. That would only reduce the contrast in the final image, because our eyes can't see that. Doesn't contribute to the color information in the photo that we could detect. But unfortunately, the wavelength of hydrogen alpha is very close to that. It's significantly reduced by this IR cut filter. One-shot color astro cameras don't have that cutoff filter, or they might have a UV cutoff but not a hydrogen alpha cutoff, because we want to get those hydrogen alpha colors.
Well, just one more thing, if you could bring it back.
Yep.
You said that some of the color cameras, they reach 80% of quantum efficiency or more.
Yep.
But if you look actually on the screen, if your nebula is predominantly red,
Yep.
you see that we throw away 75% of that light.
That's right. Yes.
So in effect, your efficiency drops. So you're only 25% of that area.
For each of the photosites, that's right, for a one-shot color
And
camera.
that's the big advantage of the on demand, because
An additional big advantage, in addition to the resolution, yes.
so in overall it's 80%, but if you're doing your narrowband imaging, it's not.
Yeah, the quantum efficiency is referring to the photosite sensor.
Yeah,
It's not actually taking into account the filters on top to make the color. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
But you can't get rid of them. I mean, once you get your one-shot color, that's the whole package you bought.
That's right.
You get your filters, and they effectively they throw away
80%.
60% or
Yeah.
whatever, 75%.
Yep. And that is an excellent point to consider when you're purchasing purchasing an astro camera. There are advantages to one-shot color cameras. I shoot with one. I'm planning to get a mono camera in the future, but there are many different factors to consider when making that choice of the camera model or camera design that you choose. The main reason I have a one-shot color camera is for the speed and convenience. I don't have an observatory, and I can't leave my telescope set up. So every time I want to have a shoot, I've got to set it all up. And I often don't have the time to collect enough data to make a full color image in one night. And doing it with the one-shot color camera, I'm capturing all of that color data with each sub-exposure. And so that's far faster to create a final image. But I'm paying for that in the sensitivity and the resolution that you gain by going with a mono camera. So having a look at a digital SLR versus a modified digital SLR or an astro camera, the blue curve you can see there is the sensitivity of a stock digital SLR camera, and the red curve is either a modified camera or a one-shot color camera designed for astrophotography, which doesn't have that filter at all. I've overlaid on a number of the key emission lines that as astrophotographers we're interested in, and you can see that stock SLR is fine for the hydrogen beta and oxygen 3, but it's terrible for hydrogen alpha and sulfur 2. We're only getting 20% of the light actually captured. So when you're taking photos of, for example, the Tarantula Nebula, in an SLR it can look very aqua, very bluey-greeny, because it's 5 times as sensitive to the bluish-greenish light than it is to the red light, which is quite predominant in the Tarantula Nebula. The same with the Orion Nebula. A digital SLR shot of the Orion Nebula is far more bluish purple than it is the pink that we'll get with a modified digital SLR. Fortunately, the native sensitivity of the camera, it considers a little peak right where we need it at the end. That's an extra maybe 10% that we got lucky just because of the way that the sensor works. But that's a good reason to upgrade from an SLR to either a one-shot color, a modified, or a mono camera. And you can see here the same sensitivity overlaid on the Orion Nebula emission graph that I showed you before. So again, the hydrogen alpha and I guess that's nickel 2 out to the far right there, they're both cut way off in a stock SLR, but we do get the hydrogen beta and the oxygen 3s. Sorry? Nitrogen, thank you, of course. So, the other alternative, mono cameras. Now, these have no filter array built onto the sensor itself. It's just a naked array of photo sites. And in this case, the photo sites do translate to pixels. So, rather than having the group of 4, red, green, green, blue, we've just got sensitive, 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 sensitive. And that means that we're not having to put any anti-aliasing or any blurring on this to get rid of those moire effects and other problems we've got. Yes?
Sorry, Neil. Can you go back and explain why there is a need for 4 photo sites for each color? You said blue, green, green.
Yep. In order to get the red, green, and blue data, we need to capture those 3 frequencies.
Yeah.
We can't really put groups of 3 onto a sensor because the 3 don't fit together well in a group. We could have little triangles, but there'd be gaps between each triangle. We reduce the sensitivity. So camera manufacturers use groups of 4, so there's no space beside them, and they double up on the green because that more accurately reflects the way our eyes see the daylight colours. So our eye being more sensitive to green, they figure it makes sense to capture twice the amount of green data.
Yeah.
So that's the basic explanation for that. But with a mono camera, we don't need that. We actually provide the filters ourselves. So there's no filters on these cameras at all, no IR cut, UV cut, no RGB. And we use a filter wheel to position the filters in front. We don't have to use a filter wheel, you can screw it into the camera itself. But if you wanted to take colour images, you'll need to be changing your filters. And it's far less convenient to have to take out your camera, unscrew the filter, put a new one in, which is why we use carousels. There are a number of different filters that you can use. If you want to recreate the natural looking colours of the R, G and the B, then you use red, green and blue filters, just like you do on the Bayer, except it's in the optical path rather than on the sensor. Those filters have a similar frequency response curve to our eyes, like that. So they're broad filters, broadband. Whereas you also have the option of using narrowband filters, which block out the vast majority of the wavelengths of light and concentrate only on the peaks of where the emission is. So the frequency of the narrowband filters, the frequency of the pass that they allow through, the light they allow through, matches up with one or more of the frequencies of the emission nebulae. Now that means that if you were to hold one up and look through it, it would either be very dark or very reflective. As you can see here, it's not permitting that light to pass through, which also means that the camera is getting far less light. But that light is focused on the wavelengths that you want. So the result is you need longer exposure times, but you get high contrast. Now I should just quickly explain what contrast is. When you've got a broad bandwidth, like you have with the different colours there, that is a low contrast colour. Now I know you're thinking, well, what's the contrast in colour? That doesn't make sense. We're going to use the contrast in brightness values, but colour is a kind of brightness of a certain wavelength. If you look at the width of the peak of the blue compared to the width of the peak of hydrogen beta, there's a huge difference. Right? There's a big difference in the ranges of wavelengths being emitted. Our eyes, the best way to explain this is probably with the example of special glasses that have been invented to assist people with colour blindness. The colour blindness is often in the red and green. Now you can see there in red and green, our sensitivity overlaps significantly. That means there's already a low contrast between red and green sensitivity in the human eye to start with. People who have colour blindness either have those peaks closer together so they almost completely overlap, or various other reasons that they don't have the ability to see the contrast between the red frequencies and the green frequencies. A company invented a pair of sunglasses which are essentially narrowband filters. They're not as narrow as we use, but they do chop off the tails of the frequencies that they pass through. So they have a column of frequency pass like this for the green and like this for the red. And that means that rather than having a big overlap here, you can see there's a huge overlap there. There's little or no overlap. And so the brain is able to see those differences in the sensitivity and therefore detect those colours. And you can see some amazing videos on YouTube of people with colour blindness putting these glasses on and saying for the first time, my God, I can see, like, that's green, that's red. Is that what that's always looked like? Because they're seeing this colour contrast for the first time that we've always been able to take for granted. Yes?
What, they're doing one for each eyes, and the brain puts it together, or how do they do it?
No, each lens has a triple pass medium band filter. So it allows through a medium bandwidth of blue, of red and of green. And the eye then combines that in the brain into a higher contrast colour image. So when you change the contrast on your...
this for people who've got reduced sensitivity rather than totally missing ones in respect.
Yes, that's right. I wouldn't say reduced sensitivity, I'd say reduced reduced ability to discriminate between the wavelengths. This allows that discrimination to be easy. So, let me take a sip.
Just, you know, in the biometric you've got RGB.
Yep.
But, you know, normal mono RGB. So, should you theoretically do that more green channel in make it more natural for one of them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually think it works the other way around.
Right.
When we're doing our one-shot colour photography, it's very often the case that you'll get the photo straight out of the combination looking hugely green. There's a very strong green cast to it. That's because the green colours are oversampled in the one-shot colour. That's right. So we need to compensate for that by doing like a linear fit or dynamic background extraction or something like that to get rid of that extra green. So rather than us needing to take more green data on mono cameras, it's actually a matter of the one-shot colour cameras are inaccurately representing the colours of the objects, and we have to correct for that. So it's another good reason why one-shot cameras aren't as good as monos. All right, so where were we? Okay, yes, we're talking about the filters. And so for RGB images, which you need to do for things like galaxies, comets, reflection nebulae, then you need to have the RGB filter set for that. And also for natural coloured stars. You're probably all familiar with the magenta tinge that you get when you use the Hubble colour palette. The only way to get around that, as Diego has been doing lately, is to take a separate set of exposures in RGB for the stars and then combine those with the narrowband photos that you take for the nebulae. You often typically use a luminance filter in order to cut out those extra frequencies that you don't want. It's sort of like the the infrared ultraviolet cut filters that are on a digital SLR. That just helps to reduce or increase the contrast from those frequencies that you don't want. And as such, many need to be a combination of LRGB and narrowband in order to get that star colour. So narrowband do offer that greater contrast, which we talked about, and can reveal more structure in the nebula that the RGB can't. So that's another reason why we often like to use the narrowband. If you look at the photo on the right there, which is by our friend Alex Obrads, that is a narrowband image of the Tarantula Nebula, and you can see huge detail in the structure of that that gas there. You can see lots of ripples and waves and layers of structure, and that is a lot harder to capture with an RGB image because we don't have that color contrast. And remember, these colors in narrowband directly relate to emission of wavelengths of light from actual gas. If there's a low color contrast, that is the color from, say, the hydrogen alpha overlaps with the color of the oxygen, and it blends together. So we don't see the distinction between the different elements as clearly. So that's why the narrowband gives us much higher contrast.
Actually, even in the using the tarantula, I find that is one that turns out particularly with less with unshot color.
Yeah.
And are you saying that using that SCNR in fixed insight is likely to dampen that?
No, the SCNR only removes highly saturated green pixels. That is likely to be coming from noise. If the green is the result of merging of two nearby broadband pass filters, that's not going to work because there's a mix of colours in there. So, we've already talked about it a bit already, but processing that data into a colour image. So, we all know we can't look at an image until we process it because the raw data is just numbers. We don't even see that, fortunately, because our computers give us a preview every step of the way. And in fact, if you're not aware of that, you should know that if you're shooting raw, and I know you all are, the photo you see on the back of your SLR, the preview that you see in Sequence Generator of a black and white image, even the processes before linearization, delinearization in your post-processing software, all of that image that you're seeing there is a preview that's rendered live from the raw data. You're not actually looking at an image as such, you're looking at raw information that has to be rendered before you can see it. That's why we go through the delinearization process. If we just rendered it as is, it'd be mostly black because the dynamic range is far too big for our displays to show. And so it's rendered with some presets to make it look as nice as possible and then displayed to us. Once you get to the nonlinear phase, then you're actually looking at the data as image one-to-one. But anything raw has to be rendered as a preview, and this is something that I teach photographers all the time. Don't judge the photo based on the preview on the back of the screen because it's the camera taking its best guess at what that should be done with that raw data. You are always going to be better at determining what you think the photo should look like when you're processing it than you are from looking at the preview on the screen. The histogram is a better representation. It's still not 100% accurate, but it's more accurate than the subjectivity of looking at a preview thumbnail on the back of the camera.
Excuse me, is the preview essentially the same as looking at a JPEG? Or
Yes. A JPEG is just an 8-bit color depth image with a certain compression algorithm applied to it. The previews that you get in your SLRs, they are JPEGs. What you see in your computer screen, I don't even know if it's a file format, but it's a way that Windows presents that raw data in an 8-bit color space that your monitor can display. Have we covered all that? Okay, no we haven't. So, there is a huge range, a huge dynamic range in brightness that we need to compress to fit into that 8-bit range. Many of you are taking photos with 16-bit dynamic range in each channel. So 16-bit by 16-bit by 16-bit for your 3 channels is a huge dynamic range. More than the human eye can perceive, let alone what a computer display can show. So we've got to take that raw data and compress the dynamic range incredibly. There are now starting to come onto the market some, they call them HDR monitors. What they really are is just a normal monitor with an array of LEDs behind that they can put into clumps and change the brightness of, so the backlight varies. It gives you a slightly extended dynamic range, but it's not really anywhere close to what the human eye can see. We're not going to see really good dynamic range in displays until OLED technology is improved. The OLED is the ability to turn off completely, so you get blacks, and they're getting the ability to become brighter and brighter and brighter so that you can actually look at them and they look like they'll actually hurt your eyes when you look at them, they're that bright. I mean, everyone's had a torch shine in their face at a star party and you realise how bright that is. Once we can get screens that are made up of millions of these OLEDs, then we can get a dynamic range that approaches the human eye. But you've also got to have all the processing power to handle these huge dynamic range images, because there's data for every variable level of brightness, and graphics cards that can push through all that to the computer monitor as well. It's going to be a while before we can start to display photos on screens that look anything like the data that's in them. We're going to have to continue to compress that dynamic range to be able to view them. Andy, I can't wait to see in 10, 15 years' time what you can do with the huge dynamic range of the faint objects that you shoot next to the bright objects, and how amazing that'll look on a HDR screen. It's going to be a whole level beyond what we're already seeing now.
The real issue is trying to print.
Printing is not possible. It's not possible to get the dynamic range. And when we're complaining about the dynamic range of our monitors, that's significantly greater than what we can get from print, because we're limited to reflection. And that's limited to the brightness of the light that's shining on it, and the ability of the inks to reflect that. And yeah, it's... People talk about how it's great to have a print in your hands and how much better it looks. Well, it's not really that true. It's true in some cases, but you're not getting as much dynamic range in a print as you can in a photo, a digital. So yes, that dynamic range is one of our key challenges. We have to balance that so that we don't blow out the bright things like the stars and the cores of bright nebula, particularly M42. That's a very obvious example. While also getting as much detail as possible out of the faintest areas, where the detail is at the same variance as the noise floor. That's why we spend so much time taking multiple exposures to try and reduce that noise floor and increase the signal to noise ratio. The detail that can be captured there, there's no end to it. You could go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and you'd see fainter and fainter and fainter things. But you still have to put that into the 8-bit dynamic range of the display.
Neil?
Yes.
On the astrocams, it advertises like 14-bit ADC, 12-bit ADC.
Yep.
Does that speak to the same thing?
That is more about the processing ability of the data storage rather than the sensitivity range. So it's the well depth is what you're interested in. That is how many photons a single photo site can hold before it overflows. And when it overflows, that means it's clipped, it's gone to white. The 14-bit ADC is more about handling that data as it comes off the chip. If you've got insufficient bit depth in that, then you're going to be throwing away data to carry that information, so that you have more data coming off the chip than the processor can identify and pass on. So don't look so much at the bit depth of the ADC, look at the well depth. That will tell you more about the dynamic range that you can get in a sensor. So this is what a raw image looks straight out of the camera from a one-shot color camera. This is displayed in PixInsight with no stretch applied, and you can see we've got quite a bit of detail there already. If you're looking at stars, that means that these stars have got enough photons captured to push their brightness value in an 8-bit depth range up to those top levels. Now, if we're looking at the dynamic range, we've got, imagine a graph left to right. I should probably have made an image for this, but on the left-hand side, you've got the darkest values, and the right-hand side, you've got the brightest values. The curve is like this, almost flat, and then spikes up. Most pixels in the scene have very little information in them. They've got the faintest little nebula in there, and the faint nebulae are a 10,000th of the brightness of the brightest stars. And so you've got a huge number, or sorry, a very small number of huge bright pixels. And so that's what sticks up above that base level there, and when we see the stars, almost all of the stars are going to be so much brighter than the nebulae that we can actually see them without stretching. But when we stretch it, then we're bringing up that base level so that it gets into this 8-bit display range. And we can actually see the nebulosity and the faint stuff that's in that data. But that's not going to work, because that's the computer saying, okay, I'm just going to push everything up by what algorithm I think is going to be a good way to do it. And that's almost never going to be good enough for what we want, because we want to emphasize certain brightness levels and change the contrast between them so that the details show up better. That is the rain chicken, yes. The block globules in the center give it away. So let's look up close at what that looks like. So we're looking at the previous image here, so the stretched image, and it's out of a one-shot colour camera. You can see quite clearly here the Bayer matrix. We've got a little checkerboard going on. The brightest ones are probably the R, the red sensitive pixels, because there's a lot of pinkish reddish colours in the running chicken. The darkest ones are probably the green, because there's very little green colour in space. Although if it overlaps with the blues, that detects it with the sort of the aqua colours, it detects it there. The stars you'll see, they're all white. That means they're giving out frequencies of light across the entire spectrum that this chip is sensitive to. And from there, we obviously have to take that and turn it into a colour image, because that is not a colour image now. Even though the colour information is in it, it's clearly not a colour image. So we have to extract all the red pixels, put it aside, all the green pixels, and all the blue pixels, and make them into channels, and then merge those channels into one image, which has the RGB values for each pixel location, and that ends up looking like this. Please don't judge the quality of my optics and camera too much from this. But this is an example here where we've taken that RGB data and we've converted it, or so that the Bayer data, we've converted it into an RGB image. And you can see it has got a really strong green tint. So there are many stages in processing this, and this is just a quick slideshow example of that. I originally created this talk for an audience which wasn't all astrophotographers. So I'm certain you all know about this already, but I wanted to include this for folks who don't know exactly how much work and how many steps there are involved in taking an image from the raw data to a final process. So each one of these steps is a very personal thing. It's subjective. You can follow guidelines and formulae online that you can see that other people have done to try and get a head start on how it looks and how you process it, if you want to go for the style that they're doing. But really, every step of the way, it's a personal choice. The contrast, the exposure, the colour balance. There are some things you can do to take out the subjectivity, like using the new tool in PixInsight, the photometric colour calibration, which tries to make it as objective as possible by looking up catalogues for colour star colours and then using that to calibrate the colour of the image. But generally, the whole way through, it's going to be a very subjective process. So the example was with a one-shot colour camera, and of course, all you mono shooters know it's different with a mono camera. So again, the disclaimer, I don't shoot mono, but I have a good idea how it works. Rather than having the RGB filters on the sensor, we have it in front of the sensor, and so we have different images that we then combine together. So we don't have the computer separate those channels out and then combine the channels. We start with those color channels separate and then combine them ourselves. We've already discussed that the actual colors for the emission lines don't line up nicely with the R, G and the B that we're used to. If the most common set of narrowband filters that I see people using is the hydrogen alpha, the oxygen 3 and the sulfur 2. I mentioned before that hydrogen alpha and sulfur 2 are so red they're beyond the ability of computer screens to display, and they're so close to each other they're beyond the ability of us to distinguish them from each other, and certainly not make a pleasing image. So processing a mono image with filters is a matter of processing each of the sub channels, then assigning a color palette to each of those. A common one is the Hubble palette, which puts hydrogen alpha to blue, oxygen 3 to green, and sulfur 2 to red. Isn't it? Oh, I got it mixed up, did I? Okay, thank you for that correction. So those of you who didn't hear, I got the sulfur and the hydrogen alpha, no, sorry, the oxygen and hydrogen alpha mixed up. So I'll correct that for the next time I present this. And that means that the result is a false color image. Okay, false color is something that the average person on the street would go, ooh, it's false. That means it's not real. Well, again, we get back to the definition of real. We're showing here real elements of the nebula. That is the distribution and brightness of the gases that are emitting those lights, those colors. It's a real thing that we're depicting. It's just not the way that our eyes would perceive it. But you could argue that our eyes can't perceive colours in that dim light anyway, so what does it matter if we're choosing different colours? So it does open the floodgates to arbitrary choices for your colour channels. There's no reason why you have to go with that the Hubble palette. You can choose a different palette. You can also even choose to use only 2 channels. There's a lot of objects out there that are bright in hydrogen alpha and oxygen, but not so much in sulfur. So you can use a bicolour channel. In fact, there was a David Mellon Awards category winner a couple of years ago that was a bicolour image. It was a part of the Large Magellanic Cloud, I believe, areas just outside the field of view of that photo. And that looked amazing. And it told us something real and useful about the structure of the nebula in that area. So here's a beautiful example of a bicolour hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3 narrowband image by Alex Obrads. Alex was very kind to allow me to use some of his narrowband images since I don't, or some of his mono camera images since I don't shoot with that yet. So this is one of the greatest challenges for us in processing our images, and that is getting the colour right. Now, as you probably guessed by what I've been talking about the whole time so far, what is right? It's so subjective. So how do we do our colour calibration? It's also not made easy by the fact that the colour calibration process is a difficult one to do. You may have an idea of how you want it to look, but getting it to that point can be really tricky. You've got to balance things, and when you're changing the red, you're affecting both the green and the blue, and vice versa. It's not a simple slider. It's a multi-dimensional adjustment that you're making, and you often have to go backwards and forwards to get what you want it to look like. That means that you often need to have a calibration target then. So you want to have a reference that is white, or at least doesn't have a colour bias. So the average colour of your reference doesn't have a peak in one of the different colour spectra. It's going to be white as an average. And you can do that by just using the stars. In any field just about that has several hundred stars, the average the average colour of those stars is probably going to be white. That's not always true though, because if the stars are amongst nebulae, or if they're being extinguished with intragalactic dust, or if you're taking a photograph of a young cluster, they're going to be biased in their colour. Galaxies can often be used, as I mentioned earlier, as a white reference, but again, you can have intergalactic dust changing the colour. You might have the object too low on the horizon, and so you've got atmospheric extinction changing the colour. It's really hard to get a good neutral white reference in astrophotos. And there are a few things actually out there that are like that. Everything has a colour, so you've really got to take averages. So yeah, we'll just briefly go over some of the ways that you can do that. Using the background, the sky, is not bad, because that's black, theoretically. That means that it's going to be a very, very dark grey, which has an even representation of colours. But that'll only work if you're taking your reference away from any nebulosity. And honestly, when we're shooting really, really faint things, we're probably going to have a lot of nebulosity in the scene. Some photos, like for example the Ida Carina, you're not going to have any background without nebulosity, so that option goes out the window. We've already talked about using stars as a reference and galaxies as a reference, but the best option I've come across lately is using the new PixInsight photometric color calibration. It uses plate solving to work out where in the sky your photo is of. It then looks at the stars in that shot and says this is what those stars are supposed to be like, what the colours are supposed to have, and references that against a catalogue of known colour temperatures or star temperatures, and it adjusts the overall colour balance of your image to try and get that to match as best as possible. That's not perfect. Again, if there's gradients, then the stars are going to vary. If you're shooting it in a little too low an elevation, atmospheric extension and so on, but it's the best that we have. So how do we display it? If you get the really obvious metaphor there, I've talked quite a bit already about displays, but it is probably the most difficult part of the whole process. It's an unsolved problem, and it's likely to be forever unsolved. If you're hoping to wait for the ideal technology to come along to show your photos just right to everyone how you want them to, you're going to be waiting forever. There's no consistency between screen types or even screens from the same manufacturer on the same production run. Different things can affect the construction of screens that could affect their colour. There was a huge controversy a few years ago when an Apple iPhone model came out, and there was a significant variance in the colour tint of the screen. You'd see people posting pictures online of one iPhone which has got a yellowish tint and one which has got a pinkish tint, and they're both the same model. Apple, which is known for its quality control, couldn't get the screens to look close enough that it didn't become obvious. They've improved things since then in that case, of course, but this issue applies to all screens. On top of that, screens change in their colour as they age. You may have noticed on your phones that they look a little bit more yellow than they used to when you got them. The different designs can burn in, and so you have the ghosts of icons on your screen that are there more than other things, and so it affects the way that the pixels display that. Your perception of the colour changes on the time of day, on the light that's around, the ambient colour, even your mood. I've processed a photo one day, gone to bed, come back the next day, forgot I processed it again. When I compared the two photos that I exported, they look completely different. The conditions were very similar, the photo was identical, the environment I edited in was identical, but they looked very different. The only major difference between them was how I was feeling at the time from one day to the next. It's practically impossible to guarantee that an image that you process will look the same on your screen as it does on everyone else's. But it's literally impossible to guarantee that.
There is one attempt at that.
Yes.
You can attempt to calibrate the screens with a device like this, which is the Spider 4 Pro. Basically, you set that up on your screen and run some calibration, and it will work out the colour balance on that. And it does an attempt at adjusting the amount of RGB that your graphics card sends to the screen to make them all consistent. But you can calibrate yours, but no one else on the internet has probably got the screen calibrated, so when you put it up online, it's not going to look the same to them. But at least you can be consistent, and if you're, I guess if you're doing professional photography, you would probably have those screens calibrated. Andy, I guess you have your screens calibrated to get natural skin tones, etc.
Although we also have an iMac and you can't calibrate that.
Oh, fair enough. Well, that's a lifestyle choice which we've gone into before.
The great thing about a colour calibrator is that it will give you consistency, and it'll mean that you control a step in the process. You have control over how it looks on your screen, and if you see how it looks and you like how it looks, then you can be confident that that's how the file is on your screen. And that way, at least when you're processing a series of photos, you can get consistency, and you know that when you're showing other people and they say, oh, this doesn't look as colourful as I'd like it to, you can say, well, on my screen, it's how I like it to be. I can't help your screen. So it is eliminating one of the biggest variables.
This one is actually owned by the ASV and is for loan to members of the astrophotography group. So you can actually borrow this, go home and calibrate your monitor or TV or whatever it is you
don't use a TV.
Well, you can try.
Sorry,
Diogo. Or your monitor, and obviously the better the quality of the monitor, the better the calibration is going to be.
Yeah.
It is available on loan, and you can take it and sign it out in the book and you bring it back to following session.
It's ideal to do it every 3 or 6 months as well. As I said, the monitor changes colour as it ages. Did you have a comment?
It doesn't calibrate my eyes though. If I work on an image for a few hours and I think that I sort of finished it, and I walk away from it and come back a couple of hours later, this looks wrong, you know.
It looks wrong.
Exactly what I was saying.
Exactly what you were saying, and I find that if you keep working on, if you over process an image,
you need to take breaks.
You need to take a break. You know, you come back and look at it and go, what the hell was I doing?
Yeah.
So that image up there on the screen actually does look like a trench.
Yeah.
So technology is improving. Monitor construction and technology for display is getting more and more consistent. The LEDs or the crystals, the screens themselves are getting better at being more consistently accurate. As Paul pointed out, we do have color calibrations, but for the foreseeable future, it is an unwinnable battle. We just have to be a bit philosophical and say we do the best we can. And to be frank, the vast majority of people who will look at our photos will say, wow, that's pretty. They won't care if it looks a bit too pink on their screen or a bit too green. If you're submitting photos for David Malin to look at though, calibrate your monitor. He does. And if your image has a blue tint and you didn't realise because your monitor wasn't calibrated, he will. In fact, he is so good with colour that he chose this year's category to be the colour of the stars. And that was a great example of what I've talked about here, how important colour is. So as I said, the best you can do is to control on your screen, and at least that way you can guarantee it looks how you want it to on your screen. So, is it really that colour? And the shorter answer is, it depends. The long answer is the talk I just gave. And that's the summary that I showed too early before. But it was, I suppose, a good lead into what we're going to discuss. So are there any questions? Yes. No, sorry, Stu, behind you first.
I was going to say, at what point then do you differentiate art from a scientifically usable colour photograph, whether it be narrow or
That's an excellent question, and it's probably a point I should have made. I talked about how the process of processing photos is very subjective. That is really what that's about. The subjectivity, those choices that you make, that's the art. So if you think that the Orion Nebula looks nicer with a bit of that purple, like the first time you saw a good photo of it was from a digital SLR camera, and when you saw one that had the good hydrogen sensitivity, it looked a bit off to you. That's your choice. If you think that it looks better with a bit more of that bluish purple than the pink, then go for it. That's the artistic decision. And that's the great thing about astrophotography as an art, because it's both an art and a science, is that we are creating works of art that we want to inspire others or that we do for our own personal satisfaction. And there is no one who can tell you that your creative vision is wrong, because it's all about what you want. If we were doing science purely, there wouldn't be any colour. The vast majority of scientists will be looking at their data either in black and white on a screen or, frankly, in charts. So essentially, as astrophotographers, we are artists more than we are scientists.
There is an exception though when you imaging planets just for the sake of
That's a good point, yes.
Not necessarily for science. You still want them to be the real color, like you don't want the funny looking Mars or something.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think that may also be because the planets are something that we have a better understanding of. We look at them and we think, that looks wrong if it's not right. Whereas if you can look at a nebula, unless you know what the nebula is supposed to look like, it's hard for you to say, no, that's not right. Maybe David Malin or Andy Campbell would be able to say, yeah, that's not how it's supposed to look, but it is very much more subjective with nebulae. But planets, we all have a pretty good idea.
Those lines get blurred. I mean,
Yeah.
Saturn is a classical example of those colours that you normally see on the Saturn.
That's true.
Don't exist.
That's true.
In reality,
Yep.
and people accept it now. So you get
Yes.
huge range of bands that are purple and
Yeah, but you
green and this and blue, and they don't.
You have
They don't exist.
rings for reference which are reasonably right. So if you
Yeah,
get
but
the
you can
rings right, then the colors shouldn't be too far off.
Yeah, but they're oversaturated. The
Oh.
Saturn globe doesn't look like that.
And the contrast
It
is
never looks
dramatically
like that.
increased to show that detail.
And people accept it, and these days, that's how it's accepted. If your something doesn't look like that, they say, oh, it's still black.
The recent images from the Jupiter probe are another great example. Those incredibly high contrast, crunchy images with those very vivid blues, you would not see that if you were there riding piggyback on the probe. It doesn't look like that.
See anything like that
Those
they are associated different colors to different frequencies. They're often very close.
Yeah.
Same as H alpha and sulfur.
Yeah.
They're so close that they would not be contrast at all.
And the contrasts are also increased to show the detail in the structure, which is not just the color contrast, but also the luminance contrast.
Also the moon as well, you put a blue filter on to get better contrast, or a very light blue filter gets your feature contrast.
And
Yeah.
moon is another excellent example.
Yeah.
You can force colors on it and they're not there.
You can win awards by forcing
throw
colours.
some paint on the canvas and tell David that, oh, this is the moon, and believe you and give you
Work for Salvador Dali.
Just so long as he can overlay a chart on it and check.
Any other questions? Yes.
Colour saturation, a bit more forcing colour saturation, image in a lighter what
Yeah, color saturation is actually just a way of describing color contrast. So when you are increasing the saturation in an image, what you are doing is you are bringing in the slopes on either side of the channels, and that increases the contrast, which has the effect of increasing saturation. So that is something that you can do selectively per channel, or you can do across the whole image. But yeah, it's nothing more than just changing the contrast. If saturation was changing any brightness values, which happens as a result because the display of the output can change that, it would potentially push the values of the pixels outside the 8-bit dynamic range, and you'd end up with clipped colours. And you can often see that on some of the brighter nebulae, like the Orion Nebula. If you have too great a saturation on that, then the colours nearby each other blend together, and you lose the detail there, and it just gets clipped out beyond the dynamic range of the file. Yeah. Now there's a question here.
Yeah. I wonder, is there a device that you can use to detect the wavelength range, like say to point on an object,
Yeah.
and to get as a result the wavelength range?
That would basically be a spectrograph.
I'm talking daylight.
Again, it's the same thing, because we're measuring, or what colour is there is basically just the spectrum. Go back to this one here. That is what you're talking about. If you wanted to see what colour something was, there's almost nothing except for emission lines that are a single colour. There's a range of colours that they encompass, particularly daytime, because everything's reflecting colour. If you used a spectrograph to examine the light coming from it, then you would see the range of frequencies across the spectrum that is being emitted or reflected from that object. And that's the only way that you can give numbers to the values of the colour that the object is. Is that what you're meaning?
Yeah.
Because
So is there a device, specific device that you know about? That
the only thing I would...
during a daylight and say point on something and
Yeah.
get as a result. So I'm more...
It doesn't give you numbers, though. It
I'm
doesn't
more
give you a
referring
readout.
to like a strong solid colour that doesn't have
Oh,
a
okay.
wide, right,
A single spectrum.
yeah.
Again, there's not much in the world that gives out a single wavelength of colour. Everything is going to be a combination of it.
a range, but something like that.
Well, there are tools that interior decorators use that you can press against an object, and it will give you a colour value for that you can then match to a paint swatch or something like that. But I don't know if that would sort of be a scientifically rigorous piece of equipment. It's a very subjective thing that would... It matches against a paint rather than giving you the frequency or the wavelength of the light. I'm not sure if that's what you were meaning.
Computer screens have a thing as well where you have your whole RGB colour, and as you pass your mouse over a particular colour, will give you the RGB values.
That will give you the RGB values of the
Yeah.
pixels that it's displaying the colour. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not exactly frequency.
So could you hold something up beside the screen?
really the only way to give an accurate frequency readout is with a spectrograph. That's essentially what they're designed to do.
That's what they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're making a bunch of prisms at the instrument making section, which is called the direct vision prism. It's composed of 3 prisms that you look through directly so it doesn't deviate the light, and I suppose you could put some sort of a calibration scale in there and you just look at objects and see where the light falls, and
You need to put a lens. You need to put a lens in front of that though, in order to distinguish what you're looking at. Yeah.
But those prisms are in a sense a spectrograph.
An old binocular is converted, you can make a contraption.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry, another question here, yes.
What does the screen put out? Is it a combination of 3 single lines, or are they spread it out?
The screen is pretty much the inverse of the Bayer filter on a sensor.
Okay.
It's an array of generally 3, in the case of LCD screens, little cells that have liquid in them that pass in front of a filter to cover it or expose it. In the case of LED screens, OLED screens, either a trio of light emitting diodes that are in RGB, or in some of the big screens that you get, they have an LED which has a trio of diodes inside the cover.
LEDs put out single lines, or?
No. You'll never get a display that can put out a broad spectrum.
One exception is the camera manufacturers now, the back screens, they add the 4th color.
Okay.
They put the 4th diode, which is the luminance. So 3 colors,
That'll give you a more bigger dynamic range. Yeah. Well, in that case, they better be making their previews.
I'm waiting for that to actually get into the monitor.
That would be nice.
You can only see it on more expensive models of Nikon or Canon.
If that was the case, though, the previews that they're generating for the screen can't be a JPEG file, because JPEG doesn't have the bit depth to display that dynamic range.
There's probably AB and luminance.
Yeah, that's great. That's an interesting technology. I'd like to see that get to our desktop displays, particularly with OLED, so that we can have the full blacks. Yeah. Any other questions? Cans of worms? I think it's something for DIY.
In a worm shop.
Sorry. 1 second. Sorry, gentlemen. I just take the question.
You mentioned using pixels like the colours.
Yes.
Are there any techniques in Photoshop that you could use?
There's probably people in this room that are better qualified to answer that. In fact, I'll pass it over to Diego, because he's a Photoshop master.
No, I'm not a Photoshop master. He's a Photoshop master.
You've done so much of your processing in Photoshop.
Yeah, I do, but he can answer better than me.
Okay.
There's a couple of things here. I mean, what Neil's been talking about is getting the stars the right colour to match the actual stars that have been measured with spectrographs, so that they know the actual frequency. And the other thing is just colour balance in Photoshop. And there's no tool in Photoshop that actually goes away like PixInsight or APP, which is AstroPixel Processor, and looks at a family of stars or particular stars within a range, and tries to fit all of your stars into that known correct colour for those stars, and adjust your picture for that, right? Because Photoshop's not designed as an astrophotography tool as such, as a scientific astrophotography tool. So you can colour balance it.
There is a tool that is free. All the other ones that you mentioned, big money. There's something called Iris, which is now almost out of book, but it still gives you the great ability to color calibrate, because you can do that manually, like point on the background and say this is supposed to be black, and then pick the star that you know in your image. I mean, you can go and identify the star as G2 or whatever, and say this is supposed to be white, and Iris will actually adjust the color balance pretty well, if not as good as I would say.
Bratislav mentioned G2V.
The software. Iris is a standalone software.
So how would it modify the Photoshop image?
No, not a Photoshop image. You'll modify your
So it changes the RGB values of the JPEG file or the RAW file and writes it back to the file?
It doesn't.
So you load a file into it.
Okay.
It'll be fits.
Yep.
So you'll identify
So you load the
each
fits.
Yeah, it converts into fits.
And what does it do?
Well, it just adjusts all the colors. It says, okay, the darks are too green or whatever, so push them towards red and blue, and your whites are too blue or whatever, and then just.
So you save the file as a new file, and you then load
That's
it.
right. Well, it'll show it to you on
Before
the
and
screen and
after.
say if you want to save it or whatever.
Yeah.
But you have to choose a known white star.
That's right.
Right.
Mm.
You can't pick
And you
just-
noticed he mentioned G2 or
Yeah,
G2b, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Our sun is a particular class of star, and to our eyes we perceive that as white light when we get all the radiation from that star. Right. So if you can pick another star out there in the universe that has the same kind of, radiation as our sun, it's a white star. It should be presented as white in the photograph, right? So that process that he's talking about means, okay, I have to know in my photo there's a star that is actually white.
It's not saturated.
That's not saturated white because you've burnt it out, and then tell it to calibrate, right? So that's one method that Neil didn't mention of how to do it. He mentioned about averaging all of the stars to say, well, all right, if you've got a whole population of stars, you should end up with something that's close to white and use that to calibrate against, or a galaxy to calibrate against, as against picking one known star that is actually white, which is sometimes very hard to do. And then PixInsight goes out and just looks at the population of stars and knows where they are. APP looks at, you'll have seen a graph of stars where they all fit from red through blue. They all fit on a particular spectral curve. And so what it does is it takes all the stars in your image and attempts to fit them onto that curve. It doesn't care whether one is white or red or whatever, it's just, okay, they've got to fit that kind of curve. Right. And then the population of stars should be correct. So there are scientific tools that do that. But Photoshop, no, I think you can get a plug-in that does it, actually.
Yeah, but it's still be manual.
Yeah.
There's
there's actually an article in the last edition of Sky and Telescope. It talks about this type of thing, and I think there's a plugin called Photoshop that does something similar, but by itself, no.
In Bratislav, Iris is the name of the software?
Iris. Iris is written by a Frenchman, actually a group of Frenchmen, but one of them is predominant force behind it. It's called Christian Buell. And
sorry, what? The name again?
Christian Buell.
Just look up Iris. IRIS.
Iris software or Iris astrophotography?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's been around for years, but it's no
very
more.
powerful. It's very powerful.
There hasn't been any development.
So the input must be a fixed file.
Or TIFF.
Okay.
Or TIFF.
Interesting.
All right, anyone else before we finish up?
One other question.
Yes.
When you were talking about doing this calibration, I assume that's after you've done the stretching. So
No.
Actually, no.
No. The stretching, I'm assuming you're talking about delinearization, taking it into an 8-bit color space. Stretching is just a preview.
Even in PixInsight, where you do your first stretch.
In that case, it doesn't matter because a stretch is just a preview. It doesn't change the data at all. So if you do a stretch so that you can see the data, then you do your color calibration, you'll need to redo your stretch because it has shifted the values around and your stretch will no longer be a good representation of your newly calibrated data.
Oh, good. Okay.
But you always do your color calibration before you take the image into the linear space. Sorry, into the non-linear space.
Yeah, I think
because
the colours of the stars could
yeah,
go up.
yeah, and the 8-bit dynamic range is not sufficient to contain all the data that you have in the raw file to accurately balance the colors. Right, well, I hope that I've been able to give you something new that you didn't already know, and I hope I didn't make too many glaring errors. But thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.